time, please just stop me.
Yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah, great. Floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me in your seminars. I know the theme of my presentation today. It's not the usual or one of the usual themes that you will get in GLO seminars. But as we discussed, it's part of the idea of how people react to external shocks, to external security-related shocks. This is a co-authored paper by myself and Athina Economou, who is actually giving a postgraduate lecture for econometrics, and she couldn't join us. So that means I can blame her for all possible mistakes and discrepancies that you may notice. Let me start by apologizing for my heavy Greek accent. But as the saying goes, you cannot teach an old dog new tricks, and I am, unfortunately, an old dog. And some of you may have noticed that the title is slightly changed. We have opted to add the shaken, not stirred punchline from the James Bond films, I believe, mostly because we wanted to highlight right from the beginning that the results we got from our estimations, from our models, are, how shall I put this, do not allow for conclusive, let's say, inferences, at least the way we interpret them. Very briefly, the presentation will more or less follow this structure. I will start with some preliminary definitional reminders of institutional trust, etc., in order to highlight how security-related events and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was a major security-related event. And therefore, this part of the presentation, you may consider it as the, let's say, the theoretical underpinnings of our paper, of our empirical investigation. I'm not going to talk about defense spending. However, I'm going, as the title obviously suggests, focus on a national security institution, the armed forces, which is directly related, given the mission that armed forces have, is directly related to a war event, to a military confrontation, to an invasion. And it's one of the national security institutions. In fact, it is the national security institution that in Europe, given the profound shake-up of the broader security environment, the broader European security environment, but also I would say on a global scale, the invasion has caused. It is currently, as an institution, as a body, is undergoing major changes, as those are highlighted in terms of the rapid increases, they are unprecedented for during the post-bipolar period increases in defense spending. So, it is, we rather, in order to justify why we focused on the armed forces, the reason is that the armed forces in all relevant surveys, and as I will say in a minute, the data we use comes from the Eurobarometer surveys, but in all such surveys, the Pew World Value surveys, the Eurobarometer surveys, the armed forces are invariably, I would say, one of the institutions that enjoys very high levels of trust, at least between the respondents of such surveys. So that's the justification of the choice we made to focus on the armed forces. And in a sense, this is a follow-up paper to another paper we did that focused on how trust towards the NATO alliance was impacted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then I will briefly present the data set that we used in our estimations, the sources, the Eurobarometer surveys, and the variables that we introduced in the models in order to examine or to try to trace any effect the invasion had on trust expressed towards the armed forces. I will very briefly go over the methodology and the conceptual model underlying our estimations. If you have any technical questions concerning the methodology, I will gladly pass them on to my co-author. She is the expert of the methodology. And finally, I will present the findings and focus on the direct and mediated effects. I will explain in a couple of slides what I mean by mediated effects of the Russian invasion in terms of trust expressed towards the armed forces between European citizens, and then back to the trust, the second or not third trust question that we added in the title of our result of our paper. Now, trust is considered to be the most important, the core element of social capital. The latter defined, and I'm using here Putnam's definition that it's widely used in the relevant literature, features of social life, networks, norms, and trust that enable participants to act together more effectively to pursue shared objectives. This is the definition of social trust. In any case, our paper does not look into the definitional debate of social capital and trust. Simply as a reminder, we have two different types of trust, horizontal and vertical, or interpersonal or social trust, which is trust towards other people, and the type of trust we are focusing here, institutional or political trust, vertical trust, which is essentially trust towards the state and state institutions. There are obviously the debate on how to define, let alone measure, institutional trust is ongoing. The definition of institutional trust that I particularly like, to be honest, I find it concise, is that institutional trust is people's belief that a country's institution will not, at worst, knowingly or willingly do them harm, and will, at best, act in everybody's interest. It's not my definition, it's Dewey and Newton's definition of 2005. For some reason, I like it. It's very concise and very clear what it implies. And just as a reminder, institutional trust is considered very, very important for the functioning of society. OECD, for example, sees institutional trust as very important for the smooth implementation of policies and a very good mechanism to induce economic growth. The glue, it is considered to be the glue that keeps the system together and the oil that lubricates the policy machine. And institutional trust also includes trust towards national security apparatuses, the police, for example, the secret services, or in our case, the armed forces. Again, drawing on the relevant literature, it has been shown that institutional trust depends on and is influenced by the perceptions and experiences citizens have regarding how well state institutions, in this case the armed forces, perform their mission. And in fact, it is those perceptions and experiences, and I would add expectations, that in a way explain the findings, the results that we have from our estimations. Again, drawing from the relevant literature, there are a number of determinants of institutional trust. They obviously include demographic characteristics, individual traits and preferences, the level of education, financial situation, and of course, ideological and political orientations of respondents, since we are referring to the answers to the responses to a survey, to the Eurobarometer surveys, and of course, partisan affiliations. All those are variables, explanatory variables that we have included in our estimations on trying to identify whether or not the invasion of Ukraine has impacted trust towards the armed forces, and in what way, in what direction this trust was impacted. Again, drawing from this is a very brief literature survey, it has been shown that major security events, including security in the broader definition of the term security, such as the 2015 refugee crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, terrorist attacks, of course, conflict and war, rebellions, insurgencies, even violent massive demonstrations, are events that have the propensity to exert an effect, to impact citizens' trust towards institutions, and specifically towards national security institutions. The reason they have this propensity is because such security events, and I'm talking about major security events, for example, a terrorist attack in the Christmas market in Germany or in France, or in the railway system in London and in Madrid, or of course 9/11 in the United States, such major security events affect directly citizens' risk or threat perceptions, and also their security, or to be precise, insecurity sentiments. And again, literature has shown that their policy preferences, their voting behavior, their values can be affected by such external shocks, external security shocks. And this is the reason we have picked the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it is considered as a major entity, a major watershed event concerning the broader security settings in the European continent, and of course internationally and globally. Now, concerning the possible impact such events, such security events have on institutional trust, there are two, let's say, competing hypotheses. The one is the well-known rally around the flag effect, arguing that such security events have a tendency to augment patriotism. If a country is engaged in war, the attrition going on between India and Pakistan currently, for example, I suspect they augment patriotism among Indians and Pakistanis, and this is expressed as more confidence and support towards the incumbent government and also the involved national security institutions. The alternative competing hypothesis is the so-called accountability effect. Now, this results from the evaluation by citizens, by people, that the institutions that have the mission to produce security have exhibited poor performance or failure to prevent or adequately respond to a major security challenge, for example, to apprehend or neutralize a terrorist, if we are referring to a terrorist attack, or to stop an invasion. In a sense, this leads to an assessment that they have failed to accomplish the mission they are designed for, and this results in a tendency of citizens to punish, in inverted commas here, state institutions, state security institutions, the armed forces in our case, by withdrawing their trust and support. So in case we discover an accountability effect as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this implies that expressed trust towards the armed forces will be reduced as a result of this accountability effect. As a reminder, although I have already
Christos,
mentioned that, yes.
Christos, if I may interrupt, and is this just a second to give you a question, a conceptual issue here. Losing trust means somehow one has to compare to what? And since, let's say, the German army was reorganized many years ago to be globally active, no longer defend the country against the Russians. So there was never the trust that we could defend against the Russian attack. We just were assuming that this would be an impossible situation. So that is very different from, let's say, the Kashmir situation, where two armies are standing aside and knowing that something can happen. So how is this going into your analysis? This kind of difficulty.
Yeah, this is an important point you are bringing up. It is correct what we are saying. Now the problem is that the factors that influence my trust towards the armed forces and the trust of my neighbor towards the armed forces may differ. I trust armed forces because I assume they are there, or they can, or they have the ability to protect me from any security challenge, from any security threat. My neighbor assumes that and trusts the Greek armed forces because assumes that they are there to protect from, let's say, the Turkish threat as we view it in Greece, since you are in Turkey right now. So this is very difficult to factor in our models because the variables we have, in fact, it's a binary variable that we yield from the Eurobarometer survey. And the question is, do you tend to trust the armed forces or tend not to trust the armed forces? It doesn't include any possible explanations of what this tend to trust and tend not to trust the armed forces. So very much this is part of the perceptions people have of what the armed forces are supposed to do, what their mission is supposed to do. And this is not easy to factor in the model. Probably this is captured indirectly from the other determinants I will be talking about in a minute we have in our models, such as, for example, the placement or on the left-right, the self-placement on the left-right of the political spectrum, or how interested is the respondent in political developments and affairs. So this may be a factor that captures, partially at least, these differences that emanate from different perceptions or different expectations that we have from state institutions in general and also from the armed forces in particular. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's how I would say. So this is, at least quantitatively, it's not possible for us to factor in, given the data we use at least, in the estimations, because the Eurobarometer surveys cover a wide range of issues, and most of the questions have this type of formulation. Do you tend to trust the government or tend not to trust the government? So it's how people, the definition each respondent gives, the perception that each respondent has.
Could I sort of follow up? Kind of, I have a conceptual issue as well, because the way that you're defining things, I mean, if there is a trust, the trust in institutions means generally that a well-functioning democracy will have the elected leaders deciding on the security aspects. And so then the army or whoever, police or army, whatever, they are behaving or acting on behalf of the elected members. And so if they are successful in defending, then it is more about dependability or, I don't know, confidence in armed forces rather than trust. Because if you have trust in institutions, then army should not be directly responsible in a way, if you see what I mean. It's not that you are going, the people are going to the army to ask them to defend. And so the trust in institutions will mean that the army or armed forces are dependable, or you have confidence in them rather than trust.
Yeah, Thank you very much. In fact, you have made my life easier because this is the reason that we have introduced in our estimations mediators that can capture this mediating effect, trust and confidence towards democracy, democratic functioning, and therefore how this affects trust expressed in the armed forces. Clearly, definitionally and conceptually, there's a difference between the term confidence and trust. However, the way the questions are formulated in the Eurobarometer survey, they refer to trust. And I'm not sure that if the average citizen has the capacity to differentiate, perhaps I'm being overcritical here, between confidence and trust. But the democratic issue that you are bringing in, we have included it as a mediating factor in our estimations to allow for this possible channel. I have a very democratic functioning country and government, and therefore this affects my trust or confidence, although they are not, again, synonyms, in the armed forces or broadly in the state institutions, police, armed forces, the judiciary, and so on. Are there any other comments? Okay, now, I'm not going to repeat what I have already said. The invasion of Ukraine, and keep that date in mind, the 24th February 2022, is considered to be a historical, I would say, turning point when it comes to the post-bipolar security settings in Europe, probably along with the effects of the new Trump presidency when it comes to European countries. And this is reflected, for example, in the recently published white paper for European defense, the Rearm Europe plan, or the Readiness 2030 plan, in order to beef up, to enhance, to augment European defense. So the invasion is indeed a turning point for European security, and as such, it is expected, or one can reasonably expect, that could affect national security institutions such as the armed forces. As I have already mentioned, we use the Eurobarometer survey to draw our data from, and we use two Eurobarometer surveys. The one is 96.3, is conducted just before the invasion of Ukraine. It was conducted between the 18th January and 14th February. The invasion was a few days later. And the next one that includes a question referring to the trust, to tend to trust or tend not to trust the armed forces, is a few months later, between June and July 2022. So we have essentially two samples of respondences, one not exposed to the invasion, and the next one exposed to the invasion, and at the time, the ongoing fierce fighting between the invading Russian forces and Ukraine. The data we have covers 35 countries, 35 European countries, and as you can see, we have countries that are members of the European Union, countries that are not members of the European Union, countries that are members of NATO, countries that are not members of NATO, countries that are neighbors, they have a border, they are neighboring either or Russia and Ukraine, and countries that are very far away in terms of geographic distance from the area of where the fighting is going on. And that's why, as I will say again in a minute, we have decided our entire sample, to estimate our models for the entire sample, and also to include subsamples in our estimations. In total, we have 48,000, just over 48,000 observations. And as mentioned already, the armed forces, and those are the percentage of people that trust the armed forces in the sample we have. And as you can see, the armed forces is one of the institutions with the highest trust among the respondents in those two surveys. 81% of people have said that they trust the armed forces, and this is just below the trust expressed towards the health and medical staff. And you can see the variation in terms of trust. For example, notice how fairly low is the trust in comparative terms towards the national parliament or the national government. And it seems that institutions such as security institutions, police, and the armed forces generally tend to attract higher trust. And this is invariably the case. If you go back to previous Eurobarometer surveys, always the armed forces emerge as one of the state institutions that enjoy very high levels of trust.
But Christos, the trust into NATO is so much lower in comparison to the armed forces. Has this to do with the composition of the data, because not everybody is in the NATO, or what? How do you explain this huge difference?
Well, I'm not sure how I would explain this difference. I would assume that due to the fact that not all countries in our sample are members of NATO. Ireland, for example, Austria, for example, Malta, for example. So that is a possible and reasonable explanation. And also, if I add to that, in some countries, I know at least from Greece, there is a very strong anti-NATO feeling. So this may also explain the lower percentage of trust towards NATO. So this is a possible explanation that I would give. Studies have shown, and in fact I have in mind my paper with another paper of ours, with my co-author, I mean, that looks into trust towards NATO. For example, people that self-place themselves in the left scale of the political spectrum, one would intuitively expect them to not to express high levels of trust towards NATO for ideological reasons. And ideological and political orientations are one of the factors that can influence institutional trust, especially for organizations such as NATO. I do not see any other comments or questions. Now, the variables that we have introduced in our estimations, the dependent variable is the trust towards the armed forces question. It's a binary variable. One respondent tends to trust the armed forces, zero respondent tends not to trust the armed forces. That's how the question is formulated. And we have all the other demographic and political orientation and self-assessment variables that could potentially exert an influence on the levels of trust towards the armed forces. For example, whether a person is employed or unemployed, the household situation, life satisfaction, political interest, self-placement on the left, center, and right of the political spectrum, satisfaction with democracy in the country, satisfaction with how democratically functions the European Union, and we have two variables that capture or are designed to capture the effect of the invasion on trust towards the armed forces. The one is a war dummy that takes the value of 1 on the day of the invasion, and the other one is the distance variable, and it is measured in terms of kilometers away of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, with the capital of the respondent. And this is the idea behind this is that somebody who resides in a country that is geographically very distant to the area where the actual fighting is taking place, for example, Portugal or Ireland or indeed Malta or Cyprus, is less affected or less emotionally involved, feels less insecure as a result of the developments, compared, for example, to a citizen in the Baltic states or in Poland or Hungary and so on. So we have those are the two variables of interest, the war dummy and the distance variable. And as we will see, both are entered. Yes, I see a hand being raised.
Yes. So On the dependent variables, given that you have trust in NATO, why not look at that? Because most countries are too small to be able to defend themselves credibly against a potential Russian invasion if they were to defend themselves alone. But they would essentially rely on the NATO assistance,
Yeah,
at least those countries which are NATO members. And with respect to the distance, you will have some countries, let's say Denmark and Poland, which, or maybe, I don't know, Denmark and the Czech Republic, let's say, which might be similar distance from Kiev. But Denmark would be much less at risk because it was never seen as part of the Soviet zone of interest. But the Czech Republic was occupied by the Soviet Union. So distance alone may not be that important. Or Norway is technically not that far. They even share a border with Russia, but they would be less likely to be invaded than, say, Estonia or Poland.
yeah, good points. Yeah, there's another one.
Yeah,
Elena?
I don't know the Eurobarometer survey that well, but do you have information on the region where the respondent is at the subnational level? Because
No, unfortunately
no,
not.
you don't, because I think that's an issue because you can have people that are very close to fighting happening, like in Romania, for example, or in Poland. So they would be much less likely to, according to your hypothesis, to trust the armed forces. So I think it's quite crude, that distance measure.
Yeah, we don't have on subnational level. This information is not provided by the Eurobarometer
Yeah.
surveys. So that's why we chose the distance between capitals. I think that was.
And then that means you cannot include country fixed effects then, right? Because then that would go away. So then
Yeah.
it goes back to the point that Jan was making, that if there's some fixed characteristics at the country level, you won't be able to. So you can't include country fixed effects.
In fact, jumping ahead, the distance variable, although it enters the results as statistically significant, the magnitude of its effect is very, very small indeed. It's almost insignificant quantitatively. Okay, although it is statistically significant, is quantitatively insignificant, and that's why we focus on the war dummy, because it is the explanatory, the variable that captures in quantitative terms, at least the impact on trust. Now, the NATO point is a very interesting one, and I'm wondering why we didn't think of that. Thank you very much. I have no response to that, and I'm asking myself why not. But it's something that we most certainly include in the estimations. However,
I mean, Finland is a really good example of this. It was a country which was very convinced about being neutral until the invasion of Ukraine. And suddenly the whole population flipped. And now everybody is in favor of being in NATO, and they joined, and they're very happy being in NATO. So, basically, Finland, they know from their own experience that they cannot defend against Russia, against a Russian
yes.
invasion alone. So the only way they can stand a chance is by being protected by NATO.
Yeah, it's a good point. In my defense, however, although this is not a strong defense, we have created a subsample that that categorizes countries as NATO and non-NATO members, trying to see whether the effect of the invasion in terms of trust towards the armed forces is different between NATO members and non-NATO members in our estimations. But your point is well taken.
And also, if I may say one more thing, and maybe you have seen that paper because I only joined now, but we published a paper where we found that people who were interviewed after the beginning of the invasion had more support for European integration, for basically.
Oh yes, I've seen that paper. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Of
Oh,
course,
okay.
yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I only joined like one slide
No,
before.
no. I haven't mentioned it, but I have seen it.
Yeah.
And probably I should have said, in order to create a firewall of protection, is that this is a work in progress. In fact, it's nothing that is at least ready to be published. It's the first presentation of our work so far. So it is, in a sense, a testing ground for me.
But
we
our
have
argument in that paper was exactly that basically at the time of an increased geopolitical risk, countries rally around the European values because it offers them additional protection.
Yeah,
compared
and
to their own strength.
again, jumping ahead, the satisfaction with the quality of democracy in the European Union emerges as one of the mediating factors that I'm giving away the findings now that reduces the negative impact the invasion has on the armed forces, and the same applies for the satisfaction with the democratic functioning of the countries of the respondents' country. I will not bother you with the descriptive statistics of the variables. As I've already mentioned, the dependent variable is a binary variable, tends to trust, tends not to trust. So we opted to use logistic regression models. Again, the main variables of interest are the war dummy and the distance variable. As already mentioned, the distance variable, although statistically significant, quantitatively is almost zero the impact it exerts, 0.3%, I think, in the entire sample, in the odds of trust in the armed forces.
But is it per kilometer or?
Kilometers, in kilometers.
Yeah, but basically, so you would expect that the effect per kilometer to be small. So what you want to consider is what is the impact of being, say, 100 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers closer?
Okay. You mean to change to allow for the scale of the distance?
Well, the thing is, so if you look at, I mean, you could do a simple back of the envelope calculation, compare, say, Warsaw, so Poland, and Spain, where you have a differential of something like 2,500 or 3,000 kilometers. How much does the additional distance matter for Spain?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good idea. Now, the next methodological decision that we made was to allow for possible mediation in the effect that we uncover, and we opted to use the KHB mediation model, and we examine whether the effect of the invasion on trust towards the armed forces is mediated by the satisfaction that respondents express with the democracy at the national level, satisfaction with the democracy at the EU level, and also respondents' political interest. Clearly, other mediators could be included here. NATO is such an example, or the self-placement on the left, right of the political spectrum. We decided to use those three mediators, mostly because those are the mediators that we have discovered that work or have a more statistically traceable impact on such an effect. But I recognize the fact that other possible mediators could have been included there. Conceptually, this is the model that we have in mind. The solid arrows, the solid lines are the direct effect on trust towards the armed forces, and the dotted lines are the mediated effect through those three mediators. And as the results we got show, those mediators seem to act as shock absorbers of the initial decline of trust towards the armed forces. I'm aware of the clock ticking, so I have to speed it up a bit. Also, as I said, we have 3 sub-samples: EU members versus non-EU members, neighboring versus non-neighboring countries, and NATO members versus non-NATO members. And I'm not sure whether I should say that or not. Surprisingly, the results are fairly consistent across all sub-samples compared to the results we get for the entire sample. This is a graphical representation of how expressed trust towards the armed forces changes from the one Eurobarometer survey to the other in terms of days of when the survey was conducted. The zero day is the day of the invasion. For the entire sample, we can see that there is a decline in the expressed in the second Eurobarometer survey. We observed that in the descriptive statistics, but this decline seems to pick up as the trend line shows. Not a similar, but interesting differences in terms of the other subgroups, in terms of geographic proximity. I see Elena has a hand.
Yeah, do you have an explanation of why there's so much variability in the second interview? That countries are like all over the place, like whereas in the first interview they're like really jumbled up together, but here, I don't know which dot is there, like at the top, and
each dot represents the day of the survey. Each dot represents
it's not the country.
The day of the survey, and this may include surveys in different countries. On, let's say, the 20th July, 20 people in Greece, 30 people in Italy, 10 people in Germany were surveyed. So I cannot come with a reasonably or defendable explanation of why this variation appears. Again, this is something that I cannot, in a sense, prove. But I suspect this variation in the dots in the second survey are associated with the turmoil and the broader security situation, environment, and discussion, because the second survey is just a few months after the invasion. Those are the months that still fierce fighting is going on in Ukraine. So this may be a possible explanation, but there's this I cannot, in a sense, prove in any more persuasive manner than what I have just said. Okay. Now, the situation changes whether we have, when we look at the subsamples, clear neighboring and non-neighboring countries present notable variation, and this comes up in the estimations that we have of the subsamples. The same applies for European and non-European countries, okay? Notable variation as well in terms of how the expressed trust is influenced and how this picks up or does not pick up as the days pass. And the same applies for NATO and non-NATO countries. Clearly, for each subgroup, we can talk about it and discuss it. But again, as I said, I'm fully aware of the clock ticking. Those are the results. But let me jump directly to the brief presentation of the findings we have here. It seems, focusing only on the two variables that of interest, the war dummy and the distance, that the war dummy is associated for the entire sample with a 5.6% decrease in the odds of trusting the armed forces. The coefficients I showed you earlier are expressed in odds ratio, which this decrease points to the presence of an accountability effect in the sense of disappointment, dismay, expressed withdrawal of trust, punishing the armed forces. And the geographic distance factor is insignificant in terms of magnitude. Maybe Jan's comment there is important, and we have to look into it. Although it is associated with decrease in the odds of trust in the armed forces, this decrease is 0.3%. So in terms of magnitude, is not important.
Yeah,
And
but
if we
basically,
look,
if you multiply it by 100, you get a 30% decrease for being 100 kilometers away.
okay, we look at it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is okay. So I'm taking notes at the same time. I apologize.
Yeah.
I apologize for that.
No,
Concerning the other determinants of institutional trust, the results are more or less what we would intuitively expect. For example, somebody, a respondent who is self-placed on the left of the political spectrum has around 28% lower odds of trusting the armed forces, whereas on the right, about 13% more odds of trusting the armed forces. Satisfaction with democracy at the national level seems to increase by 40%, 41%, the odds of expressing trust towards the armed forces. Satisfaction with democracy at the EU level seems to increase the odds of trust in the armed forces by almost 90%, which is very interesting. What is also interesting is that those people who declare themselves to be politically interested in terms of following political affairs, this variable points to a 9.2 decrease in the odds of trusting the armed forces. I apologize for the pace of changing the slides. A summary of the results for the sum samples is shown here. Again, we focus on the two variables of interest. The results are fairly consistent throughout the subsamples as well. And a summary of them shows that the war onset is associated with a decrease in the odds of trusting the armed forces in the neighboring countries, in the non-neighboring countries as well, but a smaller decrease, a decrease in the case of the EU members. However, there appears to be an 8.3% increase in the odds of trusting the armed forces for non-EU members and a 14.3% increase in the odds of trusting the armed forces in non-NATO members. And this is why we opted to add in the title of our won't be a paper shaken, not stirred question mark, is because essentially those 3-4 results suggest the presence both of a rally around the flag effect, but not in the case of the EU members, rather of non-EU countries, and an accountability effect in the case of the EU member states, and the same applies for NATO and non-NATO members. A tentative explanation for this finding is perhaps that EU member states or respondents residing in EU member countries and respondents residing in NATO member countries, perhaps they punish by withdrawing their trust from their forces as a result of the inability of NATO or the European Union, let's say, to contain Russian irredentism, or perhaps they evaluate the performance of the two institutions as being below of what they would expect to see from them. In other words, they express their dismay and disappointment towards the armed forces, and perhaps the general insecurity generated by the invasion that may lead to a reduction in the odds again of trusting the armed forces. I don't know how much time I have. I think I'm speaking for about 50 minutes or so.
Yeah, sure. Take another 3-4 minutes because we had.
Okay, very quickly through the mediation, the results of the mediation analysis. The 3 mediators are satisfaction with democracy at the national level and the EU level, and respondents as political interests. Again, the results are fairly consistent. And just to give you an overall glance, the mediators appear to act as shock absorbers. Although the reduction in the decrease in the odds of trust in the armed forces is marginal, they seem to suppress and mitigate this negative effect. But this is only marginally. For example, if we allow for the mediated effect, there appears to be a 1.5% increase in the odds of trust in the armed forces for the entire sample, 1.8% for the neighboring countries, 1.1% for the non-neighboring countries, and the only decrease is identified in the case of the non-EU countries, 0.06%, which again, it's not in terms of magnitude a great effect. All in all, I would say that our results point to a reduction in terms of direct impact towards the armed forces, suggesting an accountability hypothesis effect. Nonetheless, this reduction seems to be offset partially and very marginally by those shock absorbers or intermediate mediators that we have introduced in our estimations. And the second but not third question mark is because we identify both rally around the flag and also an accountability effect depending on which sample we concentrate. I think that's where I should stop. Thank you very much for your patience. I apologize for overstaying my welcome in terms of presentation.
Thank you.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, thank you. No, we can keep it there because just in case people want to see. Thank you for that. Questions. I think Elena had a question in the comments in the chat.
I didn't see that.
Do you have dummies for survey days then?
Sorry?
Elena, you want to ask your question?
Yes,
I was just wondering if you had because there was this variation in how people answered the trust question depending on the survey day, right? Date, sorry, not date, date. So do you have dummies for survey date?
No, we haven't, but that's an idea we can consider. No, we haven't. We haven't included dummies for the date of the survey, but we could and see how this affects the results. Thank you. Let me take a note of that.
Any other question?
Again, remember this is work in progress, so do not shoot the piano player.
While people are thinking, I just want to kind of pick on one little thing that I saw there. In one of the slides, you showed that the trust, I think it was political institutions or something like that. The trust was almost less than a half than the trust in the EU political institutions.
Yeah, you are going back, perhaps, I think here. That's what you mean? Here.
No. Later you showed the coefficient. It was, you said
the coefficient.
40% versus like 87%, something like that. There was, I think in the summary of the results, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Satisfaction with democracy at national level. At EU level, which is quite because generally you would have considered the national level kind of more important, no?
Yeah, I would agree with you. Again, we should bear in mind that this is the result for the entire
so it's the numbers thing,
sample.
isn't it?
So it is possible that countries that are not EU members but aspire for good reasons to become EU members, and this affects how respondents react to satisfaction with the democracy. And if we look at the current candidate countries for EU membership, some of them I would not call them as champions of democratic functioning, to put it mildly. So this is, again, a plausible explanation, but this would require a totally different analysis to try to identify why there is this marked difference between the national and the EU level satisfaction with the democratic functioning. For example, here, let's take the case of Albania, for example, that is a candidate country for EU. I suspect that respondents regard the quality of the democratic functioning in Albania perhaps less satisfactory compared to the EU level, or Turkey for that matter, which is also, it has been for a long time, a candidate country for EU membership.
Yeah, thanks. Klaus?
Yeah, with respect to this table we just see here, life satisfaction, I was surprised about that thing. So, do I understand this correctly? If people are satisfied with their life, there is a higher trust in the armed forces. Could it be
A
the
higher
reverse?
probability to express a trust in the armed forces.
Yeah. Could it be that, I mean, it is an issue of causality. Could it be the opposite, that trust in the armed forces has a positive effect on life satisfaction? I know life satisfaction is not happiness, is something different, but there is a causality issue involved.
Yeah, again, it is possible, but even the definition of how I and you perceive the term life satisfaction differs from one respondent to another. So it is difficult to disentangle what respondents have in mind when they answer whether they are satisfied with their lives or not. Though many of the questions that are included in the Eurobarometer surveys are there, let's say, in order to be able to have a more, a better idea of how Europeans in general perceive Europe and the operation, the functioning of Europe and their life. But again, the point is well taken, but I cannot offer
Yeah,
any.
the issue whether one would consider all these kind of variables as jointly dependent on something what is really exogenous. So it is understand to learn something. I was just surprised that that if you are feel more satisfied about your lives, then you trust also in the army. Okay, I understand the point.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Christos. That was a really
Thank you.
interesting presentation, and I hope that was useful for you as well.
Very useful. I've got some very nice ideas. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah. This also explains that we are indeed, this group is indeed interested in your topics. It's not that we
Okay,
are.
I was
Yeah.
a bit, to be honest, I was a bit apprehensive of presenting to this group because I know that my research focus, it's not, let's say, in the core of what you do.
No, we are very general. We are
definitely.
very general. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your
Great, thank
comments,
you.
and they are well received. Thank you.